The night my father told me he couldn't lend me $4,000 for emergency surgery, he was standing beside a brand new boat that cost him more than $20,000. I remember staring at the boat through the kitchen window. Then I looked down at my leg. The bandage had soaked through again. My doctor had given me 10 days. 10 days to get the infection under control. 10 days before the surgery became more complicated and possibly irreversible. My father knew all of that. He had driven me to the hospital himself. He had sat beside my bed while the surgeon explained what could happen if the infection reached the bone. He had even held my hand when I woke up. So I believed that when I finally asked him for help, he would say yes. Instead, he pointed toward the driveway and said, "We've already spent enough money this month." I looked outside. The boat was still wrapped in plastic. My mother was standing behind him. She didn't look at me. She looked at the boat. Then she said quietly, "Maybe this will teach you not to depend on people." I didn't answer. Because at that moment, I realized something was wrong. Not with my family, with the story I'd been telling myself about them. My name is Mara Bennett. I'm 37 years old, and for almost 2 decades, I helped build the family business that my father eventually handed to my younger brother. I didn't know that was the plan. Nobody had bothered to tell me. The company was called Bennett Structural Works. My grandfather started it in a rented warehouse when my father was still a teenager. By the time I joined, it had grown into a serious fabrication business. Steel frames, industrial staircases, platforms, railings, large commercial projects. My father ran the floor. My brother Evan worked with the crews, and I handled everything that required paperwork, numbers, drawings, inspections, and the kind of patience my brother never had. If a customer called at 10 p.m. because a shipment was wrong, they called me. If a bid needed to be finished before sunrise, I finished it. If a worker made a mistake on a drawing, I fixed it. And if the company was about to lose money on a contract, my father called me. For years, I thought that meant he trusted me. I never considered that he might simply need me. There is a difference. I learned it too late. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning. I was walking through the fabrication bay when I heard metal scream. Not bend. Not drop. Scream. I turned toward the storage racks. One of the upper supports had shifted. I had warned my father about that rack twice. The second time, I had even put the warning in writing. He told me we'd deal with it after the current contracts were finished. There was always another contract. There was always another deadline. So I kept working. That morning, a section of steel came loose. I tried to move. I wasn't fast enough. The impact knocked me to the floor. For several seconds, I couldn't understand what had happened. Then the pain arrived. It was so intense that the room seemed to disappear around me. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Someone else brought a first aid kit. And my father ran toward me. He dropped beside me. His hands were shaking. I expected him to say my name. Instead, he leaned close and whispered, "Don't tell the paramedics about the rack." I stared at him. "What?" He looked toward the other workers. "Just tell them you got caught underneath it. We'll handle the rest." Even through the pain, I understood what he was asking. He was asking me to protect the company. Again. At the hospital, they discovered my leg was badly fractured. The surgery went well, or at least that's what everyone told me. I spent the next several weeks recovering at home. My father visited. My mother called occasionally. Evan sent messages asking whether I needed anything. From the outside, we still looked like a family, but something had changed. Every time I asked about the workplace injury claim, my father gave me the same answer. "I'm handling it." The first time, I believed him. The second time, I reminded him. The third time, I asked for the claim number. He wrote a number on the back of a receipt. I saved it in my phone. Workers' comp. I trusted him. That was my mistake. 5 months later, my leg started burning. At first, I thought it was normal. Then the swelling returned. Then came the fever. My doctor ordered imaging. The results came back 2 days later. The infection had reached the bone. I needed another operation. Quickly. The hospital gave me a date. Then the billing department gave me a number. $4,000. I didn't have it. My savings were almost gone. I called the insurance company. The woman on the phone was polite. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Miss Bennett, this appears to be a workplace injury." "Yes." Then it should be covered through workers' compensation. I thought so too. She paused. Do you have a claim number? I gave her the number my father had written down. There was another pause, longer this time. Then she said, I'm sorry, that isn't a workers' compensation claim number. I sat completely still. What is it? It appears to be an internal order number. I looked at the phone, then at the contact saved underneath it. Dad. For 5 months, I had been waiting for a claim that had never been filed. That night, I drove to my parents' house. I brought a handwritten repayment plan, $4,000, 6% interest, monthly payments. I even offered to leave my truck title with them until it was paid. I wasn't asking for charity. I was asking my family for a loan. My father listened. My mother stood at the kitchen counter. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. Then my father glanced toward the window. I followed his eyes. The boat was sitting outside, 22 feet long, brand new, still smelling like fresh fiberglass. He looked back at me. We bought it last weekend. I thought I had misunderstood him. You bought a boat? He nodded. Had to put a deposit down. I stared at him. Dad, I need surgery. I know. The doctor said I can't wait. I know. The infection is in the bone. I heard you. Then he looked toward the boat again and said, we have bills too. My mother finally turned around. She folded the dish towel in her hands. Then she said, you've always been too independent, Mara. I almost laughed. Almost. Because there was nothing funny about it. I had spent 20 years being independent because everyone around me had taught me that needing help made you weak. Now I needed help, and apparently that made me inconvenient. I thanked them. I don't know why. Maybe because old habits are difficult to kill. I walked outside. Halfway to my car, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. It was Evan, my younger brother. He jumped out of his truck. The truck bed was empty. That caught my attention. Evan never went anywhere without his tools. He opened the passenger door. Then he walked toward me, holding an envelope. He put it in my hand. It's not much. I opened it. Cash. $600. I looked at him. Where did you get this? He looked away. I sold some equipment. My throat tightened. He had sold his tools, the same tools he'd spent years collecting. I tried to give the money back. He refused. Then he asked me something strange. Did Dad ever give you the workers' comp information? I froze. What? He immediately looked nervous. I just mean, did it work out? I stared at him. He shrugged. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I could see it in his face. Evan knew something. Something he hadn't told me. Before I could ask another question, he got back into his truck. He rolled down the window. Get the surgery, Mara. Then he drove away. I stood in the driveway holding the envelope. $600. My brother had sacrificed his tools for me. My parents had bought a boat. And somewhere between those two facts was a truth I hadn't discovered yet. I just didn't know how close I was to finding it. 3 days later, I went back to work. I was still using a cane. I couldn't stand for long, but I knew the business needed me. Or at least that's what I told myself. That afternoon, I opened an insurance certificate that had arrived in my work email. I expected to check the usual details. Coverage, dates, limits, names, everything looked normal. Until I reached one line. I read it once, then again. Then I stopped breathing. The company wasn't listed under my father's name anymore. It wasn't even listed under my father's and mother's names. The new owner was Evan Bennett. I stared at the screen. My brother. The same brother who had just sold his tools to give me $600. The same brother who had asked whether my workers' compensation claim existed. I opened the state's business records. The ownership transfer had been filed months earlier. The date was printed at the top. April 14th. I looked at the calendar. My accident had happened in January. My father had given me the fake claim number in February. And in April, he had transferred the company to Evan, without telling me. I leaned back in my chair. For 20 years, I had believed I was helping build my family's future. But apparently, they had already decided whose future it was, and they had been planning it while I was still lying in a hospital bed. I printed the document. I folded it once, then I put it inside my purse. I didn't confront my father. Not yet, because suddenly I didn't want an explanation. I wanted the whole truth. And the next thing I found would make me realize that the company transfer wasn't the betrayal. It was only the beginning. I didn't confront my father that night. That would have been easy. Too easy. I wanted to know how long they'd been planning it. So I put the document back exactly where I'd found it, closed the printer tray, and walked out of the office as if I had seen nothing. That was the first decision I made that my old self wouldn't have understood. I stopped asking questions. I started collecting answers. The next morning, I arrived at the shop 20 minutes early. My brother was already there. That alone was strange. Evan hated mornings. He usually arrived 10 minutes late, carrying coffee and complaining that Dad had scheduled everything too early. But that morning, he was sitting in the owner's office, my father's office, and the door was closed. I walked past without knocking. A few seconds later, I heard my father's voice. Once she leaves, this gets easier. I stopped. My heart started beating harder. Then, Evan said something I couldn't hear. My father answered, "She doesn't need to know yet." I kept walking. I didn't want them to know I had heard, because suddenly the document wasn't about the future. It was about something already happening. At lunch, my father called me into his office. He smiled. That frightened me more than anger would have. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine. You've seemed distracted. I've been tired." He nodded slowly. Then he pushed a folder across the desk. "Take the weekend off." I stared at him. "Why?" "You've been working too hard." For 11 years, my father had never once told me to take a weekend off. Not when I was sick. Not when my grandmother died. Not even when I broke my wrist and worked from home 3 days later. Now, suddenly, he was concerned about my workload. I smiled. "Sure." He smiled back. And for the first time in my life, I realized something uncomfortable. My father wasn't being kind. He was creating distance. That evening, I checked the company's financial records. Nothing looked wrong. Revenue was steady. Payroll was covered. The biggest contracts were active. Then I noticed something buried inside an expense report. Consulting, $18,700. Paid 3 times. Same company, same month. I had never heard of them. I searched the company name. It was a law office, my father's law office. I opened the invoices. The descriptions were vague. Corporate restructuring, ownership transition, asset preparation. I stared at those 3 phrases. Then I looked at the dates. The first invoice was 4 months old, the same month as the document I'd found. My hands went cold. This wasn't a sudden decision. It had been planned, paid for, and organized, while I was still working overtime to keep the business profitable. The next morning, I called the company's accountant. I didn't ask about my father. I didn't ask about Evan. I asked one question. "Has anything changed in the ownership structure?" There was silence. Too much silence. Then she said, "You should probably ask your father." I thanked her and hung up. That was when I knew. Something had changed. Something big. And everyone except me knew about it. 3 days later, I found the second clue. It was inside the glove compartment of the company truck. I wasn't looking for it. I was searching for an old inspection report. Instead, I found a bank envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a transfer confirmation. $240,000. Transferred from the company account. Recipient Evan Bennett. Date, 4 months earlier. The exact same week as the ownership document. I sat inside that truck for nearly 10 minutes. I could hear machines running inside the building, men laughing, a forklift reversing, my father giving instructions, normal sounds, except nothing felt normal anymore. Then I noticed the payment description. It said, buyout, personal interest. Buyout. I whispered the word. Then another thought hit me. If Evan had been paid $240,000, what had he bought? That night, I didn't go home. I drove to my grandfather's old house. It had been empty since he died. My father kept the keys, but I still had one from years ago. There was something I remembered. Grandfather had always kept important papers in a metal box beneath the stairs. Birth certificates, property deeds, old business agreements, things my father rarely talked about. I found the box. The lock was rusty. It took me several minutes to open it. Inside were decades of paperwork. Then I found something I had never seen before. A handwritten letter. My grandfather's handwriting. My name was on the envelope. Not my father's. Not Evan's. Mine. I opened it. There were only 6 sentences, but the 4th sentence made me stop breathing. Mara, if you're reading this, they've already made their decision. I read it again. Then again. The final sentence was even worse. Do not fight for the company until you understand why they gave it away. I lowered the letter. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether my family had betrayed me. I knew they had. Now, I had a much bigger question. Why would my grandfather have known it was coming? And what exactly had my father promised my brother? Because whatever was happening inside Bennett Industrial, it had started years before I ever walked into that office. And I was about to discover that the company wasn't the only thing my family had been hiding. I didn't confront my father the next morning. I did something more dangerous. I started looking. The ownership transfer was only 2 pages, but those 2 pages had opened a door, and once I stepped through it, I couldn't pretend anymore. I began with the date, April 14. I pulled every company document from that week that I could access. Invoices, bank statements, contracts, insurance records, payroll changes, equipment purchases. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I found a payment, $185,000. It had been transferred from Bennett Structural Works to an account I didn't recognize. The description said, asset acquisition. I stared at it. The company had supposedly transferred ownership to Evan, so why was company money being moved at the same time? I kept digging. 20 minutes later, I found another payment, $72,000, then another, $41,500. 3 transfers, different dates, same destination, and all 3 had been approved by my father. I wrote the numbers on a piece of paper, then I added them. $298,500, nearly $300,000. Gone. I leaned back in my chair, and suddenly Evan's $600 made sense in a way I didn't want it to. My brother hadn't been given the company for free. Something had been moved, something valuable, and I needed to know where. That afternoon, Evan came into the shop. He walked straight toward my desk. Dad wants to talk to you. I looked up. About what? He hesitated. He says you're asking questions. I smiled. Am I not allowed to? Evan looked uncomfortable. You know how Dad is. No, I said. I don't think I do anymore. He stared at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sat down. Mara, his voice was different. Not defensive, scared. What? He rubbed his hands together. Did you find the ownership papers? My stomach tightened. Yes. He looked down. I didn't know you weren't supposed to see them. That sentence told me more than he realized. I leaned forward. Who told you that? He didn't answer. Evan. He finally looked at me. Dad. I felt something inside me go cold. So he knew I would find them. Evan said nothing, and he still didn't tell me. Nothing. Why? My brother stood up. I can't do this. Do what? Choose between you and Dad. I stared at him. You already did. His face changed. For the first time, I saw guilt. Real guilt. Then he whispered, You don't understand what Dad promised me. What did he promise? Evan shook his head. I can't tell you, and he walked away. That night, I drove back to my grandfather's old house. I remembered something. My grandfather had never trusted banks with everything. He used to say, paper can disappear. People can lie. But metal remembers. I never understood what he meant. Until I found the old steel cabinet in the basement. It was locked. I searched the drawers upstairs. Nothing. Then I remembered the welding bench. Underneath it was an old magnet. I ran it across the bottom of the cabinet. Click. I found a hidden key. My hands started shaking. Inside were old business records, contracts from the 1980s, property deeds, partnership agreements, tax documents, and one envelope with my father's handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a photocopy of a document dated 18 years earlier. It was an agreement between my father and my grandfather. I read it slowly. Then I reached the final paragraph. My grandfather had written a succession clause. If the company was ever transferred, the buyer had to maintain employment and ownership rights for certain family members. I read the paragraph twice. Then I noticed something. A handwritten amendment had been attached. The amendment removed those protections, and the signature approving it was my father's. The date? 3 months before my grandfather died. I sat on the basement floor. My father hadn't simply inherited the company. He had changed the rules before the inheritance happened. But why? I called an attorney the next morning. Not my father's attorney. A stranger. I sent her copies of the documents. She called me back that afternoon. Her first words were, Mara, where did you get this? My grandfather's records. There was silence. Then she said, You need to be careful. Why? Because the ownership transfer may not be the biggest problem here. I sat up. What do you mean? She explained that transferring a company wasn't automatically suspicious. Neither were large payments. But if those payments were made before the ownership transfer, and if company assets had been moved at the same time, then there could be a much bigger issue. I asked her to explain. She said, someone may have been preparing the company to be worth less on paper before transferring it. My heart stopped. So Evan received a company that was stripped of assets? Possibly. And the money? We need to find where it went. I stared at the wall. Then I remembered the boat, the new equipment, the renovations my parents had suddenly started making around their house. All of it had happened after April. I asked one final question. What happens if I prove it? She said, then you stop thinking about revenge. I frowned. Why? Because you may be looking at a legal problem, not a family argument. I spent the next week documenting everything. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't tell my mother. I created copies of every record I could legally access. Then I found the transaction that changed everything. The $185,000 wasn't sitting in some mysterious account. It had been used to purchase a piece of property, a warehouse, and the buyer wasn't Bennett Structural Works. It was a company registered under a name I had never heard before, Bennett Holdings LLC. The registered owner was my father, not Evan. My father's name was on the property. The company's money had purchased the building, but my brother had received the operating company. My father had kept the valuable real estate. I finally understood. They hadn't given Evan the family business. They had given him the part that could fail. My father had kept the land, the buildings, the equipment leases, the property, the money, and Evan had been left holding the company name, a shell, a business that looked valuable from the outside, but was carrying liabilities nobody had told him about. I sat in my car staring at the documents, and suddenly I understood why Evan had been afraid. He hadn't betrayed me. He had been used to. That evening, I called him. He answered immediately. What's wrong? I asked. Did Dad tell you what you actually received? Silence. Evan? His voice dropped. What did you find? I said, everything. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then he whispered, I knew there was something. What? Dad told me the company was mine. He gave you the company. No. His voice cracked. He told me I had to sign something first. I gripped the steering wheel. What did you sign? I don't know. You don't know? He told me it was paperwork for the transfer. My stomach tightened. Evan, what did you sign? He started breathing heavily. Then he said the words I had been waiting for. There was a personal guarantee. I closed my eyes. A personal guarantee meant Evan could be personally responsible for the company's debts. My father hadn't just handed my brother the business. He had handed him the risk and kept the valuable pieces for himself. The next morning, I went to my father's office. I placed the documents on his desk, the property records, the bank transfers, the ownership papers, the old agreement. He looked at everything without saying a word. Finally, he leaned back. You've been digging. Yes, you should stop. Why? Because you don't understand business. I almost smiled. Then explain it. He looked at me. You were always too emotional. No, Dad. I pushed the property record toward him. I was always too loyal. For the first time, his expression changed. I had hit something. He picked up the document. Then he said quietly, You don't know what you're asking for. I haven't asked for anything. He stared at me. Not yet. I stood up, and as I reached the door, he said, Mara. I stopped. If you keep going, you won't just hurt me. I turned around. He looked exhausted. You'll destroy your brother. That was the moment I realized the final trap. He wanted me to believe that exposing him meant hurting Evan. But Evan wasn't the person I wanted to destroy. He was the person I needed to save. And I had just discovered exactly how to do it. Because there was one document still missing, the original agreement Evan had signed. And if that document contained what I suspected, my father's entire plan could collapse overnight. The original agreement was in a bank deposit box. Evan told me that himself. He had been afraid to open it, afraid of what it might contain, but now he was willing to find out. We met outside the bank just after 9 in the morning. He looked exhausted. I had never seen my brother look that scared. What if Dad was right? He asked. About what? That you're going to destroy everything. I looked at him. No, Evan. I handed him a copy of the property records. He already destroyed it. He stared at the paper. Then why does it feel like we're the ones doing something wrong? That question stayed with me, because that's exactly how my father had controlled us for years. He didn't have to threaten us. He only had to make us feel guilty for questioning him. The bank manager brought out the box. Evan unlocked it. Inside were several documents, insurance forms, tax papers, loan agreements, and one thick envelope. The name on it was Evans. He opened it slowly. The first page looked harmless. Company ownership transfer, standard language. Then we reached the second page. There it was, a personal guarantee. Evan had guaranteed the company's outstanding debts with his personal assets, his house, his savings, his truck, everything. He stared at the page. I didn't know. I know. He told me this was just ownership paperwork. I know. His hands began shaking. Then he turned the page. There was another clause. If the company defaulted on certain obligations, Evan would become personally responsible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the date. The guarantee had been signed before the $298,500 in company assets disappeared. My brother looked at me. He knew. I nodded. He knew exactly what he was doing. There was one more page, a list of company liabilities. We started adding them. Loan balance, equipment financing, supplier debt, pending contracts, potential claims. By the time we finished, the number was staggering, more than $600,000. Evan dropped the paper onto the table. He gave me a company with $500,000 in obligations. More than $500,000. He looked at me. What do we do? I had expected to feel satisfied. I didn't. I felt tired, because this wasn't the revenge story I had imagined. My brother had been manipulated too, and suddenly I understood something important. If I wanted revenge, I could expose everything and walk away. If I wanted justice, I had to save Evan first. We took the documents to my attorney. She read them carefully. Then she asked a question neither of us expected. Did your father ever tell you why he transferred the company? No. She tapped the table. Then I think I know. She explained that the timing mattered. My accident, the workers' compensation issue, the ownership transfer, the asset purchases, the personal guarantee, the property transfer. All of it happened within months. She believed my father had been restructuring the company to separate the valuable assets from the liabilities. The real estate stayed with him. The operating company went to Evan. The debts followed Evan. And if the company eventually collapsed, my father would still own the valuable property. Evan would absorb the damage. I would have been left with nothing. My attorney looked at me. There's one thing that doesn't fit. What? You. I frowned. What do you mean? If your father wanted a clean transfer, why leave your name on some of the older inspection and compliance records? I remembered my work, my signatures, my certifications, my reports. Then I understood. My father hadn't just transferred the company. He may have been leaving me connected to its history. If something went wrong, someone could try to blame me. I didn't sleep that night. I went through every old company file I had. I found dozens of inspection reports. Some were legitimate. Some had been altered after I signed them. I could tell because the dates didn't match. Someone had added information after my approval. My signature was real. The surrounding information wasn't. I photographed every page. Then I backed everything up, twice. At 2:13 a.m., my phone rang. It was my father. I almost didn't answer. I did. His voice was unusually calm. Come to the house tomorrow. Why? Because this has gone far enough. What's going to happen tomorrow? You'll find out. Then he hung up. The next afternoon, I walked into my parents' house. My father was sitting at the dining table. My mother was beside him. Evan was already there. I looked at my brother. He wouldn't meet my eyes. My father placed a folder on the table. I've made a decision. I sat down. What decision? He pushed the folder toward me. I opened it. My heart stopped. It was a transfer agreement, not for Evan, for me. My father was offering me the company, everything. The name, the contracts, the equipment, the employees, even the building. I looked at him. Why? He smiled. Because you're the one who knows how to run it. I almost laughed. You transferred it to Evan. That was a mistake. No. He leaned forward. Mara, listen to me. I looked at the agreement again. There was something strange. The document was dated that morning, and beneath the transfer terms was a condition. One condition. I had to accept all outstanding liabilities. including pending claims, including the workers' compensation dispute, including any legal consequences associated with prior company operations. I looked up. So you want me to take the company and its problems? You'll have control and you'll keep the property? He said nothing. I already knew. And the $298,500, his expression hardened. That money was used for legitimate business purposes. Then show me where. Silence. I closed the folder. No. My father stared at me. You're making a mistake. No, Dad? I pushed the agreement back. You're trying to make your mistake mine. My mother finally spoke. You're still our daughter. I looked at her. Then why did you need me to sign something before you treated me like one? She began crying. My father slammed his hand against the table. Enough. The room went silent. Then he said something I will never forget. If you walk away, this family loses everything. I looked at Evan, then at my mother, then back at my father. And I realized something. He wasn't afraid of losing the family. He was afraid of losing control of the family. Those were two completely different things. I stood. I'll help Evan. My father's face changed. But I won't save you. That night, Evan brought me one final piece of evidence, a recording. He had secretly recorded a conversation between himself and our father weeks earlier. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. Once Mara is out, the company is yours. Evan asked, what about the debts? My father's answer was calm. She'll never know about them. I froze. Then came the sentence that changed everything. My father said, she'll be too busy dealing with the surgery. The recording ended. I sat completely still. For months, I had wondered whether the betrayal was intentional. Now I knew. It had been planned around my injury. They had waited until I was vulnerable. They thought pain would make me easier to control. They were wrong, because pain had taught me something they never expected. I no longer needed their approval. And the next morning, I was going to make sure nobody could ever use my name against me again. The next morning, I didn't go to my father's office. I went to the state investigator. I brought everything. The ownership transfer, the bank records, the property documents, the altered inspection reports, Evan's personal guarantee, and the recording. I expected the investigator to react immediately. Instead, she listened quietly. When the recording ended, she asked one question. Did your father know you were injured when these decisions were made? Yes. Did he know you were pursuing workers' compensation? Yes. And did he control the company when the assets were transferred? Yes. She closed the folder. Then don't contact him again. I nodded. What happens now? We investigate. That was all she said. No dramatic speech. No promise of revenge. Just one word. Investigate. And somehow that was more frightening than anything my father had ever said to me. 3 weeks later, everything changed. The investigation uncovered transactions I hadn't even known existed. The warehouse my father had purchased wasn't the only asset. There were 2 pieces of industrial equipment, a storage property, and an investment account connected to the company. Together, they were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. My father had moved them out of the operating company before transferring ownership to Evan. The company Evan received was carrying the debts. My father kept the valuable assets, and then he tried to convince me to take responsibility for all of it. But the investigators weren't interested in family explanations. They were interested in documents, and documents don't care who your father is. The workers' compensation claim was reopened. The insurance company reviewed the original accident. Then they reviewed the report my father had tried to prevent me from making. Then they reviewed the company's internal records. My father's version of events started falling apart. The rack had been reported as unsafe. The warning had been documented. Maintenance had been delayed. The claim had not been filed correctly. And my father had known. For months, I had blamed myself for not speaking louder. But the truth was simpler. I had trusted the wrong person. Evan's situation was even worse. His attorney challenged the personal guarantee. The argument was that he had been given incomplete information before signing. The case took months, but eventually the guarantee was modified. Evan was no longer personally responsible for debts he hadn't been properly informed about. He kept his house, he kept his truck. And most importantly, he finally understood what our father had done. One evening, Evan called me. I owe you an apology. You don't. I do. He paused. I believed him. So did I. "No," he said, "you believed Dad was your father." That sentence broke something inside me, because he was right. I hadn't been stupid. I had simply believed the person who was supposed to protect me. The family business didn't survive. The biggest contracts were canceled. The insurance situation became a nightmare. The bank demanded repayment. Employees began leaving. Within months, Bennett Structural Works closed its doors. The building my grandfather had worked so hard to create was empty. The machines were silent. The office where I had spent half my life was locked. My father blamed me. Of course he did. He told relatives that I had betrayed the family. He said I had destroyed my grandfather's legacy. He said I had chosen money over family. For a while, I wanted to defend myself. Then I stopped, because people who wanted to believe him were going to believe him anyway, and people who knew me didn't need an explanation. That was another lesson I learned. You don't always have to win the argument. Sometimes you just have to survive the lie. 6 months later, I opened my own company. I called it Northline Fabrication. It started with 3 employees, a rented workshop, 2 used machines, and the same skills I had spent 20 years developing. Except this time, everything belonged to me. The contracts were mine. The decisions were mine. The mistakes were mine. The responsibility was mine. And strangely, I had never felt more free. My first major contract was small, $47,000. Nothing compared with the contracts my father's company once handled. But when I signed it, I sat in my office for several minutes just staring at my name. Not my father's. Not my grandfather's. Mine. I had spent years thinking inheritance was the ultimate proof that my family valued me. I was wrong. Building something they couldn't take away was worth far more. A year after the accident, I received a letter. It was from my father. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened it. The letter wasn't an apology. Not really. It was an offer. He wanted to sell me the warehouse, the same warehouse he had purchased with company money. He said he was willing to sell it at a family price. I laughed when I read that. A family price. There had been a time when those words would have pulled me back. Not anymore. I wrote 1 sentence on the back of his letter. Then I mailed it back. I don't want what you took from me. I want what I build myself. I never heard from him again. 2 years later, something unexpected happened. Evan came to work for me. Not because I owned him anything. Not because we were brothers. Because he was good at what he did. We started with one rule. Nobody gets special treatment. Not me. Not him. Not anyone. If something was unsafe, we stopped. If something was wrong, we documented it. If someone made a mistake, we fixed it. And every employee knew one thing. No contract was worth someone getting hurt. That rule cost us money sometimes. But it also built something my father's company never had. Trust. One afternoon, I was standing on the shop floor when I noticed a young employee struggling with a weld. He looked frustrated. I walked over. "Want help?" He nodded. I showed him what he was doing wrong. Then I stepped back. "Try again." He did. The weld came out clean. He smiled. "Thanks." I smiled back. And for a moment, I remembered my grandfather. He used to tell me that steel doesn't care who's holding the torch. It only shows whether the work was done correctly. I finally understood what he meant. Neither does life. It doesn't care who your parents are. It doesn't care what family promised you. It doesn't care who tried to keep you small. Eventually, the only thing left is what you built. My leg still hurts sometimes. The injury never completely disappeared. Neither did the scar, but I don't hate the scar anymore. Because every time I see it, I remember the night my father chose a boat over his daughter's surgery. I remember the fake claim number, the secret transfer, the hidden assets, the personal guarantee, the recording, and the moment I finally stopped asking, why didn't my family choose me? And started asking, why was I still waiting for them to? That was the real turning point. My father thought taking the company away from me would make me powerless. He thought giving the business to my brother would put me in my place. He thought my injury would make me desperate enough to accept whatever deal he offered. Instead, losing everything connected to my family forced me to discover something I should have known years earlier. They couldn't take my skills. They couldn't take my reputation. They couldn't take the years I'd spent learning, and they couldn't take away the one thing that mattered most, my ability to start again. So no, I didn't destroy my family. I didn't ruin my father's life. I didn't need revenge. I simply stopped protecting the people who had spent years protecting themselves at my expense. And eventually, they had to live with the consequences of their own choices. As for me, I kept building. Only this time, I was building something that belonged to me.